Hello everyone and welcome to my talk. I am Weizhen Huang from the University of Bonn. I'm going to present my work with the title Chemomechanical Simulation of Soap Film Flow on Spherical Bubbles. I'm going to introduce the background of our work, the physical model of the spherical bubbles, how to solve it numerically, then I'll show you some of the results and discuss the limitations. First, to the background. There are various previous works on soap bubbles. The one from Sadashige Ishiga et al., for example, focuses on computing minimal surfaces formed by soap films and the evolution of a cluster of bubbles. The work of Boju et al. Also focuses on minimal surfaces, additionally the bursting of bubbles, and the deformation of a bubble being blown. We can see that these previous works focus almost exclusively on the deformation of bubbles. The thickness variation of the bubble is not considered significant. However, the beauty of soap bubbles also stems from their interesting iridescent patterns caused by various local thicknesses, which are visible even on a perfectly spherical bubble without any dynamic deformation. There is, however, one recent work from Sadashige Ishida, which is also presented on SIGGRAPH this year, but our works focus on entirely different detail levels. Interested people may attend both talks and compare. In this work, we focus on isolated bubbles, such as the ones floating in the air, and assuming them to be perfectly spherical. Next, we will talk about the physical structure of a soap bubble, the dominant forces that drive the bubble motion, the governing equations, and how to simplify the physics. Let's take a closer view at a soap bubble. A soap film consists of water and the soap dissolved in it. Soap molecules, which have a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic end, tend to settle at the water surface so that their hydrophobic part can avoid contact with water. Soap molecules act as surfactant. That is to say, soap molecules' presence reduces the liquid surface tension. Which brings us to one of the most important forces on a soap bubble, the surface tension. The other two that we are going to consider are air friction and gravity. In this illustration, the surfactant is evenly distributed on the sphere. The surface tension is thus the same everywhere. Assume for some reason these two molecules move away from each other. This would result in two regions with higher concentrations and one region with lower concentration. The resulted surface tension gradient would again push these two molecules back in the direction they came from until an equilibrium is reached. Next, we demonstrate the influence of gravity with a vertical film. When a flat film is released under gravity, the film flows downwards, thus more soap molecules are squeezed in the lower region. As we've just seen before, the higher concentration region at the bottom would create a surface tension gradient that pushes the film upwards until it reaches an equilibrium, where surface tension force balances the gravity. The shape of such an equilibrate film would be a wedge. We integrate the wedge shape with a color chart, showing the colors of a soap film and the associated thickness, assuming sunlight with a normal angle of incidence. These colors come from the constructive and destructive interference of light waves reflected by the bubble's front and back sides. Another very important source of external force is air friction. Because a soap film is very thin, it is easily driven by airflow. This has two consequences. First, a windy environment activates the film motion. This video clip shows a four-scalar visualization of a time-varying airflow on the left side, and on the right side, the resulting velocity field on a soap bubble using line integral convolution. After initializing with a noisy texture, the fluid sacks down under the influence of gravity. Over a corridor on the surface, the air gradually starts flowing, and the soap fluid follows the excitation immediately. When the air slows down again, the soap fluid also slows down. Even in a windless setting, the air has its function to slow the motion down. Two bubbles initialized with a noise texture are released under gravity. As we can see on the left side, when air friction is absent, the bubble swings violently up and down. The liquid also moves much faster, The fluid flow is described by the 3D Navier-Stokes equations. They consist of a momentum equation and a mass continuity equation. The left part of the momentum equation represents the momentum advection, where u is the fluid velocity, and in a spherical coordinate system, it would be u theta, u phi, and ur. Rho is the mass density, sigma the Cauchy stress tensor, which incorporates pressure and viscosity, and F stands for external forces. For incompressible flow, conservation of mass is equivalent to a divergence-free velocity vector field. For soap bubbles, we have additionally the surfactant concentration transport equation, which is an advection diffusion equation. The fluid domain is a 3D domain with angular coordinates theta, phi, and the radial coordinate r. The region between r minus eta and r plus eta, assuming symmetry, contains soap solution, and everywhere else is air. Now this is an awkward representation because the film is very thin. A typical half thickness is 0.5 micrometer, whereas a typical radius being 0.5 centimeter, the ratio of these two is only 0.0001. Mixing variables of different magnitudes might cause precision problems. A simpler way is to convert the 3D fluid field to a 2D one with only angular coordinates and treat the film thickness as an additional variable depending on theta and phi. This method is called the lubrication theory. First, we need boundary conditions that connect eta to other variables. Since both surfaces are symmetric, we first consider the outer surface r equals capital R plus eta. A surface can be expressed implicitly at f equals 0, which in our case equals eta minus r plus capital R. By definition, a point on the surface remains on the surface, so we may take the total derivative of both sides and acquire the outer boundary condition. This equation means that ur can be fully expressed by the 2D velocity u theta, u phi, and the film thickness. An additional dimension is thus unnecessary. Next, we scale quantities with their characteristic values. We do this for eta with eta prime equals eta over eta 0, where eta 0 is the average half thickness of the film. For the two velocity components, we scale with u, and for the surfactant concentration, gamma 0. ur is on the radial direction and thus very small, so we scale it additionally with a very small factor, which is the ratio of the thickness to the radius. The coordinate r is scaled similarly, first subtracting the radius r and then divide by the average thickness. The scaled quantities are of the same order, so after substitution into the governing equation, we can see that different terms are of different importance. Next, we expand the variables asymptotically with a power series. Substitute the expansion into the equation system, then group terms with the same order of epsilon together to obtain a series of solvable linear equations. Finally, we keep the order 0 components and arrive at an approximation of the original problem. In the leading order approximation, we encounter some new dimensionless numbers resulting from the simplification process. The Marangoni number acts as a spring constant, which describes the rate of surface tension changes to the changes of soap concentration, and the Reynolds number is a measure of viscosity. Comparing the leading order approximation and original problem, an obvious change is that the dimension of the velocity is reduced from 3D to 2D. The 3D lambda operators now operate in the 2D domain. Also, the divergence-free condition, combined with two boundary conditions, gives the transport equation for the film's thickness. The stress tensor split into a surfactant gradient term and a viscous term. Next, we'll talk about how to solve these equations numerically. We discretize the spherical domain with a staggered grid, where velocities and scalar quantities are stored at different locations. More specifically, the u component in theta direction is sampled at the centers of the horizontal cell faces. The u component in phi direction is sampled at the centers of the vertical cell faces, and the scalar quantities such as thickness and surfactant concentration are sampled at cell centers. If we are interested in values that are not located at any grid point, they are bilinearly interpolated from nearby grid points for scalars, U theta or U phi. Values near both poles are sampled alike. One might question how the quantities are advected across the pole. After all, the velocities at the pole is undefined. But this is actually quite straightforward. We never need the velocity at the pole explicitly. We have no grid point there. We only advect grid points near the pole. And if we have a point with a velocity in this direction, we just trace it back to its last position across the pole. The velocities are usually traced in the directions of coordinate axes. That is, assuming we have 2 points to advect, one near the pole and one at the equator, both with velocities in phi direction. They are also both traced along the local longitude. We notice that the one at the equator is traced along a nearly straight line, whereas the other one is rotated around the pole. It's unreasonable that we treat points differently based on their positions. Why don't we also rotate the particle at the equator around some point nearby? Let's take another viewpoint at the advection. When we advect a point at the equator, we are equivalently tracing along the great circle that passes this point. Similarly, we may draw a great circle passing through the point near the pole and trace the particle along this great circle. Now these 2 points appear to be treated equally, independent of the underlying coordinate system. There are infinitely many great circles that pass through a certain point. In particular, we only consider the one that is tangent to the velocity vector at this point and trace along the great circle. Now that we let the velocity at one end represent the velocity on the whole arc, a more reasonable way in the spirit of the Runge-Kutta method is to trace only halfway along the arc and let the velocity at the midpoint represent the velocity on the path. We move the velocity to the current point, draw a great circle from there, and this time trace a full length. Let's compare the results of our novel advection scheme and the traditional one. The bubble is initialized with a thick region on the upper hemisphere and a thin region on the lower hemisphere. The only external force is the wind blowing across the pole. The top view of 2 bubbles are shown. Our great circle-based advection is on the left. Now notice that the thinner region is gradually blown upwards by the wind. You can see as it passes the pole, the region on the left remains in shape, while the same region on the right encounters an invisible obstacle. Now we have removed artifacts at the pole, but we are still not ready for advection. Another enemy that prevents us from simulating the fine details of the flow on a soap bubble is numerical diffusion. We can see that after a few iterations, the texture becomes very blurred. The reason for that is when we advect, we always need to sample from the last step. This is equivalent to a blurring or smoothing operator. After a few iterations, the texture might have been blurred across the globe. One solution is to not sample from the values from the last step, but always the initial values. To do that, we define a forward and a backward mapping. We first look at the backward mapping, which is responsible for pure advection. Backward mapping maps a spatial point xt back to its position at the initial step t0. This is a recursive process. We first look at the backward mapping at step 1. This point we are observing is denoted as xt1. We query the velocity at this point and trace it back to its original position xt0. Now the point xt1 is mapped to xt0, and we do this for each grid point. Now we are still looking at this grid point, but at a later time tn. This point is traced back to position xt and -1. Note that we have saved at each grid point the initial position. So if we want to know where this point xt and -1 was, we may look at its neighborhood grid points. And by backward mapping, we know that these 4 points were initially there. Assume the mapping is diffeomorphic, we may infer that xt and -1 is mapped to the same relative position to the 4 neighbors. The coordinates of xt0 are spherically linear interpolated from the neighborhood coordinates. Now to forward mapping. In contrary to backward mapping that maps a spatial point to the initial position, forward mapping maps a point at the initial position xt0 to its current position at t equals capital T. The idea is simple to understand. We just track a grid point along with the flow to its position at the next time step t1. At the next time step, it is traveled to xt2, then to xt3, and so on, finally to the current time tn. Now we have a bidirectional mapping. For each point on the sphere, we know where it originally was, and for each point at the initial time step, we know where it lands now. These two mappings are inverse mappings of each other. The backward mapping facilitates pure advection. Instead of repeatedly blurring the features from the last time step, we acquire the initial state directly from the backward mapping. So why do we still need the forward mapping? The problem is that the physical quantities do not stay exactly the same as traveling along with the flow. Take the thickness and the surfactant concentration transport equations as an example. Apart from the pure advection dphi over dt equals 0, we also have a part that depends on the local divergence and the quantity itself. That is where we need our forward mapping. Apart from tracking the position, we also accumulate the changes along the way, and these accumulated values are added upon the value interpolated from the backward mapping. Without bidirectional mapping on the left, the textures are quickly blurred and become uninteresting. In contrast, on the right-hand side with our bidirectional mapping, the textures remain sharp with more vibrant fluid dynamics. Now that we are done with advection, the body forces are applied with a single time step update. The quantities with an asterisk are the advected quantities. We can combine the first two equations to one equation for gamma, which can be expressed as a sparse matrix and solved with a conjugate gradient method. So, we are finally done with math. Now we may enjoy the exciting part. Let's look at our lab settings. We have bright light sources from the side and a diffusion panel bent in a tunnel shape that covers the bubble. The soap bubble sits in the middle of the tunnel, so when we look at the bubble, we can see that this part is exactly the shape of the tunnel, which is the light reflected by the hemisphere facing us. This is also a tunnel shape, but reversed. This is reflected by the other hemisphere. The background should be ideally black so that we can see the foreground clearly. We blow the bubbles in the lab with a straw. Notice that when we are blowing, we are creating a rapidly rotating airflow inside of the bubble. That is the origin of the stripe-like features of a soap bubble. After the straw is removed, the rotating direction changes from vertical gradually to horizontal. The speed is also gradually reducing. The dominating motion is still rotation, but we also see water drop shapes floating either downwards or upwards. That is because the thickness of these regions differ from the neighborhood regions, and they move under gravity. We simulate this scene by blowing the bubbles in a slowly changing direction. The velocity gradient leads to a shear motion and the formulation of thin stripes. The airflow gradually settles down, so that the simulated bubble. Water drop shapes with tails are clearly visible in the simulation. You might have noticed that the color gradient is gradually moving down and the film becomes thinner and thinner. The reason for that is evaporation. Since evaporation mostly depends on the exposed surface, which is constant, we model this effect by subtracting a small constant amount of eta at each simulation step. Other interesting results are presented in the paper, which you might want to have a check. There are a few limitations of our work. Firstly, for the simplicity of computation, we discard the viscosity term. But a viscous film tends to keep its texture longer in shape and has a reduced tendency to break into fractal structures. Secondly, sometimes there are completely black regions on the film, where the films become so thin that destructive interference occurs. At such a small scale, molecular forces such as van der Waals attraction dominates. Additional care has to be taken because the forces there are so strong and the boundaries are so sharp. If one wants to simulate soap film with boundaries, another interesting phenomenon deserves particular attention. At film boundaries, a complicated mechanism called marginal regeneration causes the film to become even thinner at the boundaries, producing regions that flow upwards erratically. And that's it. Thank you for paying attention. If you have further questions, please come to the Q&A session.